Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into a topic that sits squarely at the intellectual intersection of international relations, law, policy, ethics, human rights, and human security.
It really touches on so many fields.
It does. It's an issue that, as one of our sources describes, it keeps coming to haunt us, and it's something, many of us grapple with whenever global crises unfold.
Yeah, you see it in the headlines all the time.
Exactly. We're talking about the evolving concept of international intervention and the international community's profound role when states fail, utterly fail, to protect their own people from atrocities. We've got a fantastic stack of sources to unpack, tracing the journey from the traditional, almost sacrosanct notion of state sovereignty.
Which was really dominant for centuries.
Right, all the way to the complex and often controversial idea of the responsibility to protect, or R2P as it's known.
R2P, yeah.
We'll explore its surprising origins, its noble intentions, some truly unexpected and even tragic consequences, and even a groundbreaking new way of thinking about what needs to happen after an intervention concludes.
The just postbellum aspect, which is fascinating.
Exactly. So get ready for an exploration that will undoubtedly challenge some of your assumptions and deepen your understanding of, well, global responsibility.
Indeed. This deep dive into the source material will brilliantly illuminate the inherent tensions, the real push and pull between a state's fundamental right to govern itself without external interference.
The core of sovereignty.
The core, yes, and the international community's clear, moral, and increasingly legal imperative to act when mass atrocities spiral out of control. We'll meticulously trace the intellectual and practical journey of this concept, from the foundational UN Charter right up to the very latest contemporary debates.
And we'll try to figure out why.
Exactly. And explore why, despite its undeniably noble aims, R2P remains the subject of such intense controversy and scrutiny.
Okay, let's unpack this. And our journey begins in a very specific place and time. Right. The genesis of R2P, from non-interference to new paradigm. Our journey begins specifically in 1945 with the drafting of the UN Charter. What was the overwhelming preoccupation of the UN's founders during that time? What were they really worried about? And how did the Charter initially address the use of force, particularly concerning a state's internal affairs?
Well, the UN founders, you have to remember the context. 2 world wars. Their overwhelming preoccupation was preventing states from waging war against each other.
Understandable.
Absolutely. The devastation was unimaginable, so their primary focus was establishing a framework to maintain international peace and security. The Charter itself was, well, quite revolutionary in outlawing the use of force across the board.
A huge step.
A massive step. There were only 2 explicit exceptions written in. First, self-defense against an armed attack. Pretty straightforward. And second, authorization by the Security Council for action in cases of threats to international peace and security. That's under Chapter 7, which gives the Council enforcement powers, including military action if necessary.
Okay, so that covers state-on-state aggression.
Yeah.
But what about what happens inside a state?
Well, when it came to a state's internal affairs, the Charter explicitly pointed in the opposite direction. Article 2.7 stated very clearly, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state."
Wow, okay. That's pretty unambiguous.
It is. It set a very high and clear boundary for state sovereignty, emphasizing a real hands-off approach to a country's internal issues. This was deeply rooted in the Westphalian view of absolute state sovereignty.
That old idea of the state being supreme within its borders.
Precisely, which prioritizes non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states above almost everything else.
So the initial setup was remarkably clear. States waging war on each other, absolutely not. But external force in response to an internal catastrophe, definitely not, at least according to the letter of the Charter.
Exactly. And this principle of non-interference in domestic affairs, it remained a leading, almost unbreakable commandment in international discourse for decades. Really powerful norm.
Even with things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, even with the later adoption of influential human rights instruments like the 1948 Universal Declaration and then the 1966 International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the foundational barrier of non-interference was still seen to take precedence.
So the human rights talk was there, but not the teeth for intervention.
Pretty much. The rhetoric around human rights was certainly important. It laid critical groundwork, no doubt. But it didn't immediately translate into a justification for external military intervention within a sovereign state's borders. These documents established norms, absolutely vital norms, but the enforcement mechanism for internal human rights violations, especially coercive ones, was still largely absent.
Now, fast forward to the 1990s. The Cold War ends, and suddenly there's this wave of optimism, right? International cooperation, a sense of a new world order emerging.
Oh, definitely. A real sense of possibility.
But what happened that quickly challenged that euphoria? And how did it give birth to this intense debate around what came to be called humanitarian intervention?
Well, that initial optimism was palpable, especially following the successful international defense of Kuwait against Iraq's invasion in 1991.
Right, the first Gulf War. Seemed like the system worked.
It really seemed like the international system, with its rules-based framework, was working as intended, at least for interstate aggression. But that euphoria didn't last long at all.
What changed?
The international community quickly found itself facing a series of horrific internal crises. Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, Haiti, Kosovo, just one after another. These were not traditional interstate wars between two sovereign nations.
No, these were different.
Completely different. They were internal catastrophes involving mass atrocities committed either by states against their own populations or by non-state actors within failing states. And these horrific events, they ignited fierce debate, polarized the international community profoundly.
How so?
Well, on one side were those arguing fiercely for a right to intervene, or droit d'ingérence, as it was championed by figures like Bernard Kouchner of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders.
Saying someone had to step in.
Exactly. But on the other side were equally strong claims about the primacy and continued resonance of national sovereignty, which was seen as an absolute barrier to any such coercive intervention.
The old guard versus the new need.
You could say that. The world was watching as unimaginable suffering unfolded, yet the existing legal and political frameworks seemed completely inadequate to respond effectively.
This is where the debate truly sharpens. The very idea of humanitarian intervention itself was problematic for some, wasn't it? Even the term.
Absolutely. The terminology itself generated significant resistance and, frankly, ethical dilemmas. Humanitarian relief organizations, most notably the International Committee of the Red Cross, strongly opposed the phrase humanitarian intervention.
Why?
Because they fundamentally resisted juxtaposing or identifying humanitarianism with military force in any circumstances. They were terrified, really, that associating their life-saving neutral work with military action would inevitably compromise their impartiality, their perceived neutrality.
And their access to people who needed help.
Critically, yes, their access to populations in need. This highlighted a deep-seated tension in the very framing of the problem. It was a conceptual minefield from the start, where the language used had profound operational consequences.
So, in direct response to this deeply polarizing debate and the international community's evident paralysis, the Canadian government established the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, or ICSS, in 2000. What was its groundbreaking contribution? How did it shift the conversation?
The ICSS, co-chaired by Gareth Evans and Mohamed Sinoun, delivered its landmark report, The Responsibility to Protect, in 2001. And its most conceptually significant contribution, truly a paradigm shift, was to insist on a new way of talking about sovereignty itself.
Oh, so?
Drawing particular influence from the insightful work of Francis Deng, who had worked on displacement in Africa, the Commission argued that the essence of sovereignty should now be understood not primarily as control, control over territory and people.
Not the traditional view.
Right, but as responsibility. This meant states have a primary responsibility to protect their own populations from 4 specific mass atrocity crimes: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity.
Okay, so the state's job first.
Primarily. But then the report introduced the crucial caveat: if a state is unable or unwilling to fulfill this primary responsibility, maybe it lacks capacity, or maybe it's the perpetrator.
Right.
Then that responsibility shifts to the broader international community. This was a profound, fundamental departure from the traditional Westphalian view of absolute state sovereignty, where external powers were explicitly barred from interfering in internal affairs.
So it fundamentally reframed sovereignty not as an absolute shield, but as a conditional right almost, dependent on a state's good behavior towards its own citizens.
In essence, yes, you could look at it that way. It subtly but powerfully shifted the framing. It moved away from external actors asserting a right to intervene, a phrase laden with historical baggage, often associated with colonial undertones and powerful states imposing their will.
Which made many countries very nervous.
Understandably so. Instead, it emphasized the existing responsibility to protect, held by states themselves. Only when states manifestly failed in this primary duty would the international community acquire a secondary responsibility to take collective action, including, potentially as a very last resort, military intervention.
So it put the onus on the state first, making international action a consequence of failure.
Exactly. It made the international community's actions a consequence of a state's failure to uphold its own duties, rather than an arbitrary external imposition. And this reframing, it actually helped gain broader acceptance, particularly among developing nations who were wary of interventionist rhetoric.
This new way of thinking gained significant traction then, culminating in its inclusion in the 2005 World Summit Outcome document. What factors contributed to this historic endorsement? How did it become a globally recognized principle?
Well, the explicit endorsement of R2P in paragraphs 138 and 139 of the 2005 World Summit Outcome document was a truly significant success for its advocates. A major achievement.
Especially given the timing, right? Post-Iraq.
Yeah, absolutely. This was especially remarkable given the prevailing and highly sensitive post-Iraq environment, where concerns about sovereignty and unilateral action were incredibly heightened. A crucial observation here is how several factors converged.
Like what?
There was persistent and influential advocacy by sub-Saharan African countries, led notably by South Africa, which lent significant moral and political weight to the concept. It showed this wasn't just a Western idea.
That's important.
Crucially important. Also, several key Latin American countries also embraced these limited sovereignty principles, which was historically significant given their own past experiences with unwanted intervention. And finally, Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, he played a critical role through effective last-minute personal diplomacy with leaders of wavering countries. Really pulled out the stops.
So a mix of regional leadership, changing attitudes, and diplomacy.
Exactly. This confluence of global advocacy, combined with strategic diplomatic efforts, truly reshaped international norms and brought this concept to the forefront of global policy. The outcome document stated, quite clearly, each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And it went on. This responsibility entails the prevention of such crimes. We accept that responsibility.
So your statement.
Very clear. And further, it outlined the international community's responsibility to encourage and assist states and to use peaceful means first, but also implied stronger measures if needed. 2. The core of R2P, defining its scope and navigating challenges.
Okay, so R2P gets endorsed, but the ICI's report was very careful to live out a high bar for military intervention, recognizing the gravity of such action. What specific criteria did it establish for a just cause for military action? How did they try to ensure it wasn't a justification for every internal conflict?
They were very deliberate about this. The ICA set a high and tight bar for military intervention under R2P. Very specific. It specified 2 core thresholds for what they called a just cause, focusing really on the scale and the nature of the atrocities.
What were they?
The first was large-scale loss of life, actual or apprehended, with genocidal intent or not, which is the product either of deliberate state action or state neglect, inability to act, or a failed state situation.
So mass killing or deliberate starvation, things like that.
Exactly. Systematic killings, starvation campaigns, or even allowing widespread disease and violence to decimate a population through sheer neglect or incapacity. The second threshold was large-scale ethnic cleansing, actual or apprehended, whether carried out by killing, forced expulsion, acts of terror, or rape.
Targeting a specific group.
Right. Systematic campaigns to remove an ethnic group from a territory through extreme violence, often using rape as a deliberate weapon of war. But, and this is important, look at what this explicitly excluded.
What did it leave out?
Many other forms of, frankly, unconscionable behavior like widespread imprisonment and torture of political opponents, the violent suppression of protests, or even overthrowing a democratically elected government, while certainly warranting other responses.
Like sanctions.
Exactly, like targeted sanctions, diplomatic pressure, maybe international criminal court referrals. These were deemed insufficient to justify military action under the R2P framework itself.
Ah, okay.
The intention was really to limit military intervention to the most extreme and egregious cases of mass atrocities, precisely to avoid abuse of the concept.
So it wasn't a carte blanche for intervention. It was designed to be very narrowly defined to only address the absolute worst human protection crises.
Exactly. It sought to create a very precise and restrictive set of conditions to avoid that perception of an open-ended right to intervene, which, as we discussed, had been a major source of concern for many states, particularly those highly sensitive about sovereignty and historical experiences with external interference. The specificity was meant to build trust and legitimacy.
Okay, so the threshold was high. But despite clearly defining the threshold for when intervention might be justified, one of the biggest sticking points, then and now, has always been who have the authority to intervene. What was the ICS's position on, say, unilateral intervention without UN approval? And why did this remain such a major source of controversy that R2P struggled to resolve?
Yeah, the authority question, that was, and frankly still is, the elephant in the room. The ICS acknowledged that the question of authority for intervention was profoundly divisive, and it certainly didn't offer an easy answer.
What did they say?
The Commission noted that achieving consensus around any proposal for military intervention not authorized by the Security Council or the General Assembly would be, and I quote, impossible. They were realistic about that.
So UN approval needed.
Ideally, yes. However, they also recognized the grim reality that in the face of Security Council inaction paralysis due to vetoes, for instance, and egregious atrocities unfolding on the ground, it was unrealistic to expect that concerned states will rule out other means and forms of action to meet the gravity and urgency of the situation.
So they kind of left the door open a crack.
They did. This statement really highlights the core dilemma. How do you uphold the UN Charter's framework of collective security, which rests on the Security Council, while also acknowledging the moral and political imperative to act when the Council itself is blocked?
The Kosovo situation comes to mind.
Precisely. The Independent International Commission on Kosovo, looking back at NATO's intervention in 1999 without explicit Security Council authorization, famously described that action as illegal but legitimate.
Illegal but legitimate. Wow.
Yeah, and they warned against allowing that gap between legality and perceived moral legitimacy to persist. It underscored this profound tension.
That brings us to a critical point. So the ICNs essentially walked a tightrope here. They recognized the problem of Security Council paralysis, but didn't provide a definitive, universally accepted solution for it.
Exactly. They identified the problem, but couldn't really solve it within the existing UN structure. As Nicholas Wheeler, a key scholar in this area, noted, neither the original ICS report nor the 2005 World Summit outcome document, nor the later 2009 General Assembly debate adequately addressed what happens in the event of Security Council paralysis. What authority do individual states have to unilaterally intervene?
Still unclear.
Still very unclear. A 2008 UK House of Commons paper echoed this, stating it remains unclear whether in the event of Security Council paralysis, a unilateral intervention would prove legitimate or legal. This foundational question remains largely unanswered, and why? Primarily because of the veto power held by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. The P5. Their national interests often preclude consensus, which significantly limits R2P's practical application whenever there isn't P5 agreement. And remember, the original ICSS proposal for a code of conduct for the P5 to not use their veto in mass atrocity cases.
Yeah.
That was unfortunately jettisoned during the 2005 negotiations, so the impasse was basically solidified.
Okay, another challenge. Now, the evolution of R2P has also seen a notable shift towards emphasizing prevention. The ICS report itself claimed prevention was the single most important dimension. But is this truly the case, or is it, as some critics suggest, a way to sidestep the harder, more confrontational issues of military intervention?
This is a point of considerable debate and has drawn significant critique. It's tricky. While the ICSS report indeed stated that prevention was paramount, it also, somewhat contradictorily, claimed that R2P implies a responsibility to react to situations of compelling need for human protection.
So, both prevention and reaction.
It mentioned both, but critics felt the emphasis shifted conveniently towards prevention. Critics like Thomas Weiss, for instance, found the report's focus on prevention, or what he called its mumbling and stammering about prevention, rather preposterous.
Strong words.
Yeah. He suggested it was a superficially attractive but highly unrealistic way to try and pretend that we can finesse the hard issues of military intervention. Remember, the original question posed by Kofi Annan that prompted the ICS Commission.
How to respond to Rwanda and Srebrenica.
Exactly. It explicitly focused on response to unfolding atrocities, not prevention. And the relatively short section on prevention in the ICS report itself, only about 9 out of 85 pages, further fuels this critique. It suggests a disparity between the rhetorical emphasis and the substantive focus on the most difficult questions.
So what does this all mean? Is the emphasis on prevention an admirable and necessary goal for long-term stability, which it obviously is? Or is it, as you've suggested critics argue, a convenient distraction from the difficult, immediate realities of military intervention when populations are actively being targeted?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, many scholars argue that while prevention is undoubtedly vital, absolutely a noble goal, an exclusive or predominant focus on it can, in practice, serve as a way to evade the urgent question of what to do when mass atrocities are already unfolding right now.
Kicking the can down the road, maybe.
Some would argue that yes. In their view, the shift to prevention, especially when it's divorced from a robust response mechanism, obscures the essence of the most urgent part of the spectrum of responsibility, to protect those caught in the crosshairs of war. This tension between prioritizing long-term prevention efforts and the immediate need for a robust, potentially military response when populations are actively being targeted remains a central and unresolved challenge for R2P.
So it's about timing.
It's a question of both timing acting before or during, and, crucially, the political will to undertake the more costly and risky reactive measures when prevention fails. 3. The moral hazard debate. Unintended consequences and the path to conflict.
Okay, let's dive into one of the most provocative critiques of humanitarian intervention in R2P, the concept of moral hazard. It sounds like something directly from an economics textbook. Can you explain what it means then at context and then how it applies here to international intervention?
Yeah, it really does come straight from economics. Moral hazard in economics refers to a phenomenon where providing protection against risk, often through insurance, unintentionally promotes irresponsible or even fraudulent risk-taking.
How does that work?
Well, the classic example is car insurance. If you insure your car against theft, you might become less vigilant about where you park it. Maybe you don't bother locking it every time, thus inadvertently increasing the risk of theft.
Because you're covered anyway.
Right. The perceived cost of the negative outcome is lower for you. Similarly, financiers might make riskier loans to unstable countries because they expect, say, the International Monetary Fund to bail those countries out if things go bad, even if a bailout isn't guaranteed.
Okay, I get the economic idea. How does Alan Cooperman apply this to R2P?
Well, Alan J. Cooperman applies this analogy directly to humanitarian intervention and R2P. He argues that the emerging norm of R2P, while intended to protect vulnerable groups from genocidal violence, can perversely increase the very violence it seeks to prevent.
Increase it. How?
He calls it an imperfect insurance policy. While it offers the promise of protection, it can also incentivize risky behavior by certain groups.
That's a truly counterintuitive and unsettling idea. How exactly does humanitarian intervention, meant to save lives, actually cause violence, according to this theory?
It's important to understand the causal chain Cooperman proposes. He argues that genocidal violence often arises as state retaliation against sub-state groups, rebels, secessionists for challenging the state's authority.
Okay, rebellion triggers crackdown.
Often, yes, and a brutal one. The emerging norm of R2P, Cooperman argues, by raising expectations of diplomatic and military intervention from the outside world, can lower the perceived cost of rebellion for these sub-state groups. It might make them think they have a better chance of success, or at least survival, if they rebel.
Because they expect help to arrive.
Exactly. This can manifest in a couple of ways, according to Cooperman. It can lead to irresponsibility, where rebel leaders, feeling emboldened by the prospect of intervention, provoke a conflict they might otherwise avoid, expecting international intervention to save them from a stronger state.
Gambling on intervention.
Or even more cynically, it can promote outright fraud. This is where rebels might deliberately provoke massive retaliation against their own civilian populations.
No, really?
Yes, specifically to attract international attention and trigger intervention, deeming it a necessary tactic to achieve their political goals, like independence. The tragic irony, Cooperman points out, is that intervention, in practice, often arrives too late or is inadequate to avert that initial brutal retaliation against civilians.
So the violence happens anyway.
Right, causing some genocidal violence that, in Cooperman's view, might not have occurred if the rebels hadn't been incentivized by the hope of intervention to provoke it in the first place.
Kuberman doesn't just theorize this, though. He backs this up with some powerful case studies from the Balkans, right? Tell us about Bosnia and Kosovo and how they illustrate this moral hazard in action.
Yes, his research, which included extensive interviews with key officials from the region, provides compelling, if disturbing, evidence from the Balkans. In Bosnia, for instance, Muslim leaders rejected alternatives like remaining within Yugoslavia or a plan for cantonization, a kind of soft partition. Instead, they opted for armed secession.
Which seemed risky.
Extremely risky. Cooperman describes it as initially seeming suicidal, given their military weakness compared to the Serbs. And this decision triggered brutal Serb retaliation that, over 3.5 years, killed an estimated 100,000 Bosnians, mostly Muslims, and displaced millions.
A horrific outcome.
Truly. But Cooperman found that Muslim leaders did expect massive Serb retaliation. And crucially, they were not in an anything-to-lose situation. They had security and rights within Yugoslavia, albeit imperfect ones. Instead, he argues, they firmly believed that international recognition of Bosnia's independence would ensure intervention, both politically and militarily.
They counted on the cavalry arriving.
That's the argument. This expectation, a clear manifestation of moral hazard, drove their actions, even leading them to persist in fighting a losing battle specifically to attract that international intervention.
What about Kosovo?
A similar dynamic, according to Cooperman. In Kosovo, ethnic Albanians faced severe oppression under Milosevic's regime, yet they adhered to nonviolence for nearly a decade, despite terrible provocations.
That violence first.
For a long time, yes. It was only when the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, launched a full-scale rebellion in 1998 that Serbia retaliated with its brutal counterinsurgency. Cooperman argues that militant Albanian leaders, including figures like Hashim Thaçi, were well aware of the massive Serb retaliation that would occur. They did not believe they could defeat Serb forces on their own.
So what was their plan?
Their calculus, Cooperman asserts based on his sources, was that the only way to save Kosovo was foreign military intervention. They explicitly expected NATO to act on their behalf. In both Bosnia and Kosovo, Cooperman argues, the expectation of intervention rather than inherent military strength or the inevitability of violence appears to have been the primary driver for these seemingly suicidal rebellions.
A chilling calculation. Did Cooperman's research also delve into the ethical justifications these leaders might have used internally? Or whether there were dissenting voices within their movements about this moral hazard strategy? It highlights a truly dark side of strategic maneuvering in conflict.
That's a really important question. Cooperman's work primarily focuses on the observed strategic calculus of these leaders, based on their actions and statements, and the evidence he presents points strongly towards a perceived necessity, however grim, to invade intervention.
So less on the internal debate.
Right. While his research doesn't delve deeply into the internal ethical debates or potential dissenting voices within these movements, which would be a fascinating area for further study, absolutely, it strongly suggests that for the leaders who ultimately drove these decisions, the anticipated civilian suffering was seen, tragically, as a necessary catalyst.
A means to an end.
Essentially, yes. They were, in effect, making a high-stakes gamble on the international community's eventual response, believing that without such an intervention, their political goals, independence, survival, were simply unattainable. It speaks to a very difficult and often tragic dimension of leadership during intense conflict.
While Cooperman presents a compelling, if deeply uncomfortable, argument, is there another side to this moral hazard discussion? What are some of the nuances or counter-arguments, particularly from scholars like Goodman, who might offer a different perspective?
Yes, there are definitely counter-arguments and nuances. Goodman's work, for example, raises important questions about Cooperman's pretext model, which is the idea that R2P could be easily manipulated by powerful states as a justification for wars they want to fight anyway.
The idea that intervention is just an excuse.
Exactly. Goodman challenges the idea that simply legalizing or normalizing R2P would automatically lead to more intervention based solely on these cynical pretexts. He argues, interestingly, that domestic incentives for intervention might actually be less likely to lead to war when the dispute is primarily humanitarian in nature.
Why is that?
Compared to, say, territorial or economic disputes, where the direct national interests urging intervention might be stronger and more compelling for powerful states. He also suggests that legalizing R2P could empower domestic humanitarian groups within potential intervening states.
How so?
They could use the R2P framework to insist on limits, to ensure the intervention stays focused on humanitarian goals, which might actually help prevent conflict escalation rather than cause it. The critical point Goodman makes is that the underlying social science studies supporting the pretext model might be based on unconvincing conclusions.
So he's questioning the evidence for the moral hazard argument itself.
He's suggesting that the risk of moral hazard, or at least its scope and frequency, might be overstated or perhaps too narrowly focused on the intervening state's potential for abuse rather than the complexities on the ground.
So it's not a clear-cut case where R2P always leads to unintended violence. Perhaps the type of issue at stake and even domestic politics within the intervening state can play a significant role in determining how it plays out.
Absolutely. This particular aspect offers a great deal of insight because Goodman encourages critical thinking. He suggests that while, yes, humanitarian rhetoric has historically been used as a pretext for war.
Like Hitler in Czechoslovakia, you mentioned.
Exactly. Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 was justified, supposedly, by a desire to alleviate the suffering of ethnic Germans there. So the phenomenon exists. But Goodman argues R2P itself might not create a new justificatory framework that wasn't already available.
Interesting point.
Indeed, the ICS itself found that prior to 1999, the rhetoric of humanitarianism had been used most stridently in cases where the humanitarian motive was weakest. This implies the problem isn't necessarily R2P, but the opportunistic use of any rhetoric by unscrupulous actors.
So R2P sets conditions, but doesn't guarantee intervention.
Right. Goodman further points out that R2P sets necessary but not sufficient conditions for intervention, and the big fear of a flood of interventions after R2P was adopted, it simply hasn't materialized.
We see more in action, maybe.
Exactly. In fact, there are arguably far more instances of inhumanitarian non-intervention where atrocities happen and no one steps in than actual interventions justified by R2P. Even David Chandler, who was initially quite skeptical of R2P, now suggests that the concept can actually facilitate non-intervention.
How? By emphasizing the state's own duty.
Precisely. By emphasizing the host state's primary responsibility to protect its own citizens, it gives external states a justification for inaction when the host state is not seen as manifestly failing. So the concept of moral hazard is indeed complex. It operates on evolving expectations among states, sub-state actors, potential interveners. Its scope is widely debated, from the Balkans to Darfur and beyond. It's definitely not a simple one-to-one causal relationship. 4. R2P's limitations and critiques. Sound and fury signifying nothing.
Okay, moving on from moral hazard, some critics, like Aiden Hahir, are much harsher in their overall assessment of R2P. He suggests that for all its prominence and good intentions, R2P essentially obscures its hollowness. What exactly does he mean by this rather damning critique?
Yeah, Hahir's critique is quite pointed. He argues that while R2P has undeniably changed the discourse surrounding humanitarian intervention, it's become, an obligatory reference point for researchers and policy discussions, it's broadened interest in the subject.
So people talk about it more.
Definitely. But, he argues, it has contributed little of substance or prescriptive merit in practical terms. He posits that the ICS report, despite its mandate to reconcile human rights with state sovereignty, ultimately fudged the key issues, just didn't tackle them head-on.
Which key issues?
Specifically, he here points to the lack of substantive reform for the UN Security Council, the veto problem we discussed. Also, the unresolved question of the legitimacy of unilateral humanitarian intervention, and even the precise threshold for intervention, arguing it remained too vague.
So core problems weren't solved.
That's his argument. Furthermore, the later shift in focus from response back to prevention, according to Hahir, evades the key issue which prompted the ICS to draft its report, again, How to Respond to Rwanda and Srebrenica, and fails to provide a viable or innovative approach to that immediate problem.
So in his view, the shift to prevention was a way to avoid the hard part.
Essentially, yes. It sidesteps the immediate, urgent problem of reacting to ongoing atrocities.
So while R2P undeniably changed the language we use, Hahir's critique suggests it merely papered over the cracks of old problems. But wouldn't even a semantic shift, changing how states talk about these issues, eventually pave the way for real change, even if slowly? Or is it truly just a great slogan but little else in practice?
That's a crucial point, isn't it? It gets to the heart of the debate about the power of norms versus hard law and political reality. He here concludes, quite bluntly, that R2P is undoubtedly a great slogan, though little else.
Ouch.
Yeah. He points out that despite all the soul-searching and extensive research involved, the ICS left us very close to where we started. From his perspective, little tangible progress has actually been made on how decisions about the use of force for R2P purposes are made or implemented in practice.
So the decision-making hasn't changed.
Not fundamentally, he argues. While a semantic shift can be a precursor to deeper normative change, he here argues that in this case, the shift has been largely rhetorical. It allows the international community to sound like it's doing more, to express concern, without actually taking the difficult, costly steps needed to fundamentally alter state behavior or the Security Council's decision-making dynamics.
The gap remains.
The gap between rhetoric and reality for him remains vast.
The 2005 World Summit explicitly endorsed R2P, which at the time seemed like a big win, a huge step forward for the concept. But your sources indicate significant concessions were made during those negotiations. What were these concessions, and what were the practical consequences of watering down the original ICSES proposal?
Right. The agreement at the 2005 World Summit to include R2P in its outcome document was indeed presented as a major success. But it definitely came with major compromises that, according to critics like he here and others, undermined the essence of the original proposal. They essentially created what some call R2P light.
R2P light. How was it diluted?
Well, several ways. First, on the critical question of authority. The ICS's idea that the P5 should agree not to use their veto powers in mass atrocity situations that propose code of conduct was completely jettisoned early in the negotiations. Gone.
The veto remained absolute.
Absolutely. Additionally, the notion of legitimate intervention without explicit Security Council approval, which the ICS had cautiously acknowledged as a possibility in extreme circumstances, was basically sidestepped. Ignored.
Okay, what else?
Second, the just cause threshold in the outcome document was actually more restrictive than what the ICS proposed. It limited R2P triggers strictly to genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity.
How was that more restrictive?
It was narrower than the broader remit the Security Council had actually exercised under Chapter 7 in the 1990s. Think about Haiti in 1994, which involved restoring democracy, not strictly one of those 4 crimes. Lastly, the threshold for international action was subtly raised. While the ICS suggested responsibility transferred when a state was unable or unwilling, the outcome document raised this to a manifest failure.
A higher bar to clear.
Arguably, yes. A semantic change, perhaps, but critics argued it raised the bar for triggering international action. And crucially, these concessions meant that the 2 major goals of the original R2P adherence, securing a P5 obligation not to veto and clarifying legitimacy outside the Council, were simply not incorporated.
And the U.S. position.
The U.S. notably made its support for the final wording explicitly conditional on the maintenance of its discretion, its freedom to act or not act based on its own judgment. That further highlighted the limits of the commitment.
This sounds like the international community gave R2P a nod and a public endorsement, but essentially pulled its teeth at the same time, leaving the fundamental power structures completely untouched.
That's certainly how it was viewed by many critics, as a step backward in terms of practical application and enforceability. It's important to understand how the reassertion of Security Council primacy, with the veto intact and no alternative path clarified, meant that the fundamental question, what happens when the Council is paralyzed, remains completely unanswered.
So we're back to square one on that.
Pretty much. Decisions about intervention continue to be made in an ad hoc fashion by political leaders balancing national interests, legal considerations, world opinion, perceived costs, and humanitarian impulses, much as they were before R2P was ever conceived.
Same old calculus.
The semantic change, critics argue, is of little practical use to those suffering in the midst of mass atrocities, as the underlying power dynamics and decision-making processes haven't fundamentally shifted. The rhetoric had evolved, yes, but the capacity for decisive collective action, especially against the will of a P5 member, hadn't.
So if R2P creates no truly new legal obligations, and decisions are still made on an ad hoc, interest-driven basis, what is the fundamental barrier to preventing atrocities? Is it a legal problem, a conceptual problem, or something else entirely?
Well, according to many analysts, the core issue, as Simon Chesterman noted quite sharply, is fundamentally a lack of political will, not a lack of legal or political restrictions.
Just not wanting to do it.
Or not wanting it enough to pay the price politically, financially, militarily. This inertia was tragically evident during the Rwandan genocide, where the world stood by despite clear warnings and ample legal justification under the Genocide Convention. The question remains, why should this deep-seated reluctance to accept responsibility for the welfare of citizens and other states suddenly dissipate simply because of a new concept like R2P?
Especially when intervention is costly and risky.
Exactly. It's interesting. Tony Blair declared in 2005 that states do not have the right to do what they will within their own borders. But as Chesterman points out, this was, in fact, simply false in a way. Because legal developments since 1945, including the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, already established clear state responsibilities towards their citizens. Sovereignty was never truly absolute after World War II in legal terms. Cathal Nolan even observed that even post-colonial states, often the staunchest defenders of sovereignty, accepted certain limits on it. So the idea that states had internal obligations wasn't new.
This raises an important question. It seems there's a profound disconnect between the grand rhetoric, the existing legal obligations even before R2P, and the grim reality of inaction. Why is that political will so consistently lacking, even when the legal and moral argument seems so compelling?
Indeed, the irony is stark, and it really speaks to the complex interplay of national interests, costs both human and financial, and the perceived benefits, or lack thereof, of intervention for the intervening states.
The UK Foreign Secretary example.
Right. Jack Straw, then UK Foreign Secretary, claimed in 2005 that R2P, if it had been in place a decade earlier, would have saved thousands in Srebrenica and Rwanda. A bold claim. Yet at that very moment in 2005, as he was speaking, hundreds of thousands were enduring a horrific reign of terror in Darfur, Sudan.
While R2P was supposedly in effect.
Precisely. Prompting Kofi Annan, then UN Secretary General, to lament, "We were slow, hesitant, uncaring, and we had learnt nothing from Rwanda." This just underlines the critical point. The problem isn't primarily a lack of a legal framework or an appealing concept. It's rather the consistent failure to mobilize genuine political will and deploy effective resources when it matters most to prevent or stop mass atrocities.
So the words changed.
The discourse has changed, the words are different, but the willingness to act decisively, especially when direct national interests aren't clearly implicated or the costs and risks are perceived as too high, simply has not kept pace. That's the enduring challenge. V beyond conflict, the emerging importance of jus postbellum.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Moving beyond the immediate conflict and the debates around intervention itself, our sources suggest a much broader rethinking of the entire law of armed force. Traditionally, it's been understood as this dual system. Just ad bellum, the right to wage war, and just final, the rules for conducting war. But Carson Stand argues this dualist conception is increasingly anachronistic, just not fit for purpose in modern conflicts. What are its limitations?
Yeah, Carson Stand makes a compelling case that this traditional dualist view, which really solidified in the interwar period, is no longer sufficient for the complexities of modern warfare, and especially post-conflict realities. He points to several critical limitations.
Like what?
First, war itself has been formally outlawed as a legal institution in the 20th century, primarily by the UN Charter. This means there's no longer a clear dividing line between a state of war and a state of peace in legal terms. War is now treated more as a factual event regulated by different bodies of law, rather than a legitimate legal paradigm you can enter and exit cleanly.
So the on-off switch is gone.
Pretty much. This changes how we conceptualize the end of a conflict. Second, related to that, there's no longer a clear distinction between war and peace in practice either. The classical dichotomy has lost significance because, as Stahn points out, an astonishing 95% of armed conflicts in the last decade have occurred within states, not between them.
Internal conflicts dominate.
Overwhelmingly, which means international law now operates heavily in these messy, extended transitions from conflict to peace, often involving peacekeepers, state building, long occupations. The dualist system also creates an artificial sense of exclusiveness, assuming separate rules for distinct periods, war versus peace, and it fails to reflect the growing interrelation between armed violence and the complex process of restoring peace.
It oversimplifies things.
It really does. It simplifies a very complex and fluid reality, often leaving a critical gap in legal governance after the fighting stops but before stable peace is achieved.
So it's like we've been trying to fit a multidimensional evolving reality into a very rigid two-dimensional box.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. A crucial observation here is that the classical concepts of jus ad bellum, why fight, and jus in bello, how to fight, contain significant gaps regarding the comprehensive management of post-conflict relations. They just weren't designed for it.
They came from a different era.
Totally. They were conceived at a time when concepts like individual criminal responsibility for war crimes, the humanization of warfare, and especially large-scale international state-building efforts were far less developed, if they existed at all. For example, the traditional rules of occupation, jus in bello, which focus mainly on the occupier maintaining order and respecting existing laws, are really difficult to reconcile with modern reconstruction efforts.
Which are much more ambitious.
Far more. They often involve transforming governance, rebuilding economies, reforming justice systems, things the old occupation law never envisioned. This limitation became acutely apparent in the occupation of Iraq after 2003.
House.
The UN Security Council essentially had to invent a new model of multilateral occupation. This model tried to merge traditional belligerent occupation rules with Chapter 7 peacemaking functions like promoting democracy. But it left many fundamental legal questions unanswered regarding the coalition provisional authority's actions, things like the privatization of the Iraqi economy or the creation of the Iraqi Special Tribunal. It really highlighted the inadequacy of the old dualist framework for these contemporary complex challenges.
If this dualist approach is insufficient, then what's the argument for recognizing a third distinct branch of law, just post-bellum justice after war, and how would it bridge these gaps?
Well, the case for just post-bellum is compelling precisely because, as Stahn highlights, contemporary interventions are now often justified, at least rhetorically, by a whole bundle of post-conflict-oriented purposes.
Like promoting democracy or human rights.
Exactly. Defending universal values like human rights, promoting democracy, supporting self-determination. It's only logical, then, that this crucial post-conflict phase, which often motivates the intervention itself, should be legally recognized and regulated, not just treated as an unplanned afterthought or governed by inadequate old rules.
Makes sense. Is this a new idea?
Not entirely new in concept, but the push for legal recognition is more recent. Historically, the link between war and peace was primarily framed in moral terms. Just war theory, for instance, argued that a just war requires a just peace, but just post-bellum was largely a moral paradigm about the victor's duties.
More ethical than legal.
Right. However, the experience of modern humanitarian interventions, particularly those involving long-term administration like in Kosovo or East Timor, is seen to create a clear moral and arguably emerging legal responsibility for reconstruction and nation-building. This experience has spurred calls from scholars for a much better theorization of post-war justice, aiming for a more complete theory of just war that includes the end phase.
Kosovo is an example again.
Yes, in the specific case of Kosovo, the extensive administering functions performed by the UN mission, UNNI, and NATO forces, KFOR, were even seen by some legal scholars as a formal requirement of the legality of the humanitarian intervention itself, basically arguing that the intervention was only legitimate because it included this commitment to post-conflict governance, implicitly imposing a clear post-conflict responsibility on the intervening actors.
This is quite a profound reimagining, isn't it? This isn't just a new moral framework to guide us. It's a push for a distinct legal one.
Absolutely. The explicit argument being made by scholars like Stahn is to translate just post-bellum from a largely moral or philosophical principle into a concrete legal notion with potentially enforceable rules and obligations.
Does it have historical roots?
It does, actually. The concept itself has deep roots, even if not fully developed as a legal branch. Thinkers such as the Spanish theologian Francisco Suarez back in 1621 distinguished 3 periods of a just war, including explicitly the period after victory, and he formulated principles on things like reparations and property rights for the conquered state.
Wow, 17th century.
Yeah. Similarly, Hugo Grotius, the Dutch jurist in 1625, and Immer de Vattel, the Swiss philosopher, in 1758, also discussed aspects of post-conflict principles. They talked about rules for surrender, moderation in acquiring sovereignty, the importance of good faith between former enemies, and principles for fair peace treaties. So the idea of legal principles governing the aftermath of conflict has deep roots, but modern scholarship is pushing for its full crystallization into a distinct, recognized legal branch, reflecting the complex realities of modern peacebuilding.
So what would this modern just post-bellum, or as Stahn calls it, rules and principles of post-conflict peace actually look like? What are some of its core ideas and organizing principles that would guide states and international actors in building lasting peace?
Well, a modern just post-bellum would involve several key adjustments and principles, crucially moving beyond historical understandings that might have favored the supposedly just victor. First, a core idea is that it must be decoupled from the historical understanding which associated fairness with the idea of justice in favor of the party which had fought a just and lawful war.
So, Fairness for everyone involved.
Exactly. Instead, considerations of fair and just peace must be deemed to apply equally to all parties to a conflict, even if there were violations during the conflict by one side or another. This strengthens the need for accountability, compensation, and rehabilitation across the board, regardless of who won or who was right in starting the war. It seeks to balance the interests of different stakeholders, victims, former combatants, civilians, minorities, in transitions from conflict to peace.
Okay, what are the main principles?
Stahn suggests 6 organizing principles as core to this framework. First, the right to self-determination. Post-conflict settlements must ensure collective interests are respected and provide adequate representation for self-determination groups in constitutional settlements. It's about ensuring genuine political participation and addressing root causes of conflict by respecting the will of the people, a principle often ignored in historical peace treaties imposed by victors.
Makes sense. What's second?
Second, the demise of punishment for aggression. Basically, international practice since 1945 indicates a significant move away from harsh territorial punishment like annexing land, which was historically used for deterrence and retribution after major wars. Think Treaty of Versailles versus post-WWII Germany and Japan.
A different approach.
Yes. Instead, the focus has shifted towards more moderate techniques like state responsibility, reparations, apologies, disarmament, and institutional security arrangements like demilitarized zones. This aims to prevent future conflicts without unduly punishing entire populations for the actions of their leaders.
Third principle.
Third, the humanization of reparations and sanctions. This principle prohibits the indiscriminate punishment of populations through things like excessive reparation claims or overly broad economic sanctions that cripple the whole society. The goal is to ensure the economic potential of the wrongdoing state isn't destroyed and to prevent the deprivation of basic subsistence for its people.
So, targeting sanctions better.
Exactly. This is reflected in the shift towards targeted sanctions, freezing assets of leaders, travel bans rather than broad economic embargoes, and also a stronger recognition of socioeconomic human rights obligations, even towards populations of defeated states. Fourth, the move from collective to individual responsibility. This is fundamentally reflected in the crystallization of individual criminal responsibility through international criminal courts like the ICC. This principle prohibits collective punishment, holding individuals accountable for their own wrongdoings, war crimes, crimes against humanity, rather than blaming an entire population for the acts of its rulers. It's a fundamental aspect of modern justice.
Fifth principle.
Fifth, the preservation of state sovereignty and integrity. Generally speaking, post-conflict arrangements should avoid undermining the state sovereignty and territorial integrity of the affected state, unless there are very specific legal reasons or internationally recognized principles, such as genuine self-determination leading to agreed secession. The aim is usually to restore stable governance within existing borders, not to dismantle states without legitimate cause, recognizing that stable states are often essential for lasting regional peace.
And last one.
And finally, number 6, the principle of institutional stability. This means that post-conflict arrangements should actively aim to ensure long-term stability by establishing effective national and local institutions. These institutions should be based on representative governance, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. The idea is to promote sustainable peace by building robust and legitimate political structures from the ground up, rather than imposing external solutions indefinitely or leaving a power vacuum.
What stands out to you about this comprehensive framework? It sounds like a truly holistic approach aimed at ensuring not just an end to fighting, but a genuinely more just and stable peace afterward.
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is how these just postbellum principles would potentially have an indirect but profound impact back on the phase of armed conflict itself, the jus in bello phase.
Oh, so?
Under such a framework, parties fighting a war would operate under a general obligation to conduct hostilities in a manner that does not preclude a fair and just peace settlement in the post-conflict phase. Think about avoiding tactics that poison future reconciliation, like mass rape or destruction of crucial cultural heritage.
So the end shapes the means.
Exactly. It highlights a truly interconnected vision of the law of armed force. It moves beyond just focusing on why wars are fought, jus ad bellum, and how they are fought, jus in bello, but critically also encompasses how they end, jus post bellum, and how sustainable peace is built. It views the entire cycle of conflict through a lens of holistic justice that begins even before the fighting is over. It's a much more complete picture. Outro.
Wow. Okay. What a deep dive into the complex world of humanitarian intervention and international law. We've seen how the well-intentioned idea of R2P emerged from a desperate need to act in the face of mass atrocities, reframing sovereignty, as you said, from simple control to a profound responsibility.
A really significant conceptual shift, at least on paper.
Right. But we've also uncovered its significant limitations. The unresolved dilemma of who actually has the authority to intervene, especially when the Security Council is blocked. The ongoing debate over whether the focus on prevention is a genuine strategy or perhaps a convenient evasion of harder truths about reaction, and the sobering reality that political will, that crucial ingredient, often remains elusive when it matters most.
Absolutely. And we've grappled with that provocative concept of moral hazard, the unsettling possibility that the very promise of intervention can, in some specific tragic cases, unintentionally incentivize conflicts and escalate violence, as we explored through those powerful examples from the Balkans.
Gosh, difficult idea to confront.
It really is. It's a stark reminder that even the noblest intentions, when applied in complex geopolitical landscapes, can have unforeseen and tragic consequences, creating, as Cooperman put it, that imperfect insurance policy where the insured might take on greater risks precisely because they feel somewhat protected.
But then there's also the forward-looking idea of just postbellum, that tripartite view of armed conflict that demands we think rigorously, not just about the right to go to war and how we fight it, but crucially about the justice of the peace that follows.
Moving beyond just stopping the violence.
Exactly. This framework aims to ensure that post-conflict settlements are fair, that they prioritize individual over collective responsibility, and that they actively build lasting stability through robust, legitimate institutions. Thinking about the whole cycle.
Ultimately, this deep dive shows us that while the international community has certainly made progress in conceptualizing its responsibility to protect, the journey to effectively implementing it, actually saving lives consistently, and ensuring truly just and sustainable peace afterward is fraught with immense challenges.
Challenges both legal and political.
Both in terms of refining the legal frameworks, like developing just postbellum, and critically in consistently mobilizing the necessary political will to act decisively and responsibly.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, listening to this? It means recognizing that phrases we hear all the time, like responsibility to protect, are far more than just slogans. They encapsulate decades of profound legal, ethical, and historical debates, often leading to unforeseen consequences and difficult trade-offs.
It's never simple.
Never. Engaging with global crises isn't just about feeling we should do something, but really understanding the intricate, often paradoxical impact of our intentions and actions, or indeed, our inaction. So, for your own further exploration, here's a provocative thought to mull over. If the emergence of R2P, as some critics argue, has primarily led to a semantic change in international discourse rather than fundamentally altering actual state behavior or decision-making on intervention, what single concrete action or maybe shift in approach could genuinely bridge this persistent gap between rhetoric and effective, responsible action in the face of mass atrocities?
And how do we do that while mitigating those unintended consequences like moral hazard?
Right. And furthermore, what is required to ensure that our pursuit of justice after war truly shapes the way we prevent and react to conflicts before they spiral out of control? How does just postbellum influence just ad bellum and just in bello in practice?
Big questions to ponder.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration gives you a much richer and more nuanced perspective on these critical global issues.